Oh, good. I was just reading your piece, but why don't you explain it? Because you can do it better than me while we were trying to get the get the phone working.
Sorry about that. Hey, good morning. Yeah, so I wrote this piece in the 74 million, and what I'm trying to kind of sound the alarm bells on is that coronavirus. Obviously, we're having all these conversations about virtual instruction and safely returning back to schools, but what we have to understand is the school finance system has really struggled with adapting to all of these changes. And the problem is that, obviously parents are unhappy with school reopening plans. And one of the things I highlighted in the piece is that there's this survey from Civis Analytics showing that about 40% of parents have indicated that they've switched their schools based on their prior schools' reopening plans. What this does is it puts huge financial pressure on school districts because when you lose kids, you lose funding. And so what's happening now is states are all talking about ways to basically lessen the financial blow on a lot of these school districts because of this enrollment churn, as I call it. So what this the problem is there's like as you mentioned, a lot of states already have declining enrollment, and when you have declining enrollment, there are huge financial problems. Districts are not really built to shrink. So when you start losing kids, they really struggle to right size their operations, which means shifting around staff, maybe repurposing buildings, assets, all of that. So the way I look at coronavirus is it's kind of magnifying already existing problems. And what we have to be careful about is make sure we kind of just focus on addressing the crisis and see all these problems with how districts, adjust or don't adjust to changes in enrollment. Treat that as a separate issue, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And like you were saying, the problem with a crisis like the coronavirus is anytime you have a crisis and you have pressure, you're just going to reveal the fault lines that were already there and exacerbate them. And you touch on that a lot in the piece. But talk about, just briefly, you led into it a little bit. These are all problems that have been boiling, and coronavirus has just kind of been the accelerant for a lot of these issues.
Yeah, that's right. So, like I highlighted how in North Carolina, you already had a majority of the districts were already projected to see enrollment declines. Yeah, these problems have been boiling not just in terms of the financial pressures, but it's also exposing kind of some of the over standardization of the system. So states have had a heck of a hard time trying to figure out, for instance, how do you track kids right now?
Right.
I mean, because they had all these standards around seat time requirements. If a kid's in school and they're enrolled, they need to, schools need to operate a certain amount of set hours or instructional hours per day or days per year or weeks per year. And that's a pretty highly standardized system. And now all of a sudden when these things are more up in the air because you have to do online or, asynchronous virtual instruction, the system has really struggled with that. And as you mentioned, so it's really put pressure and exposed some of these problems. But then, of course, there are opportunities moving forward. And, I'm assuming that's probably where we're going next.
Yeah, well, we want to get to those too, but one other thing, you talking about the finances here, the other piece of that financial puzzle is coming up here in the spring, and you mentioned standardizing and the standardized testing that's going to be coming due in the spring. Does anybody have a plan, not just the classroom skies, but the other piece of that is often the standardized testing? Does anybody have a viable plan on how we're going to adjust for that piece of the puzzle in education?
States are all doing different things. Of course, some states have had plans to basically stay virtual for most of the year. In North Carolina, they've had kind of a phase back in plan. So the plans vary, is what I'll say. But there has been a lot of talk about, lamenting kind of lost learning time. And, okay, well, how are we going to give kids these tests if maybe they haven't gotten all the material? I'm actually interested to see if, maybe students will, still perform even if they haven't had the set, amount of hours. And that could also expose that, hey, maybe the system, maybe we don't need to have a totally standardized system for kids to still do well and stay on track with their studies.
Yeah. Back to what you were saying about we've seen a whole summer of